Hello and welcome to Archives and Records Simplified. So a quick word about these videos. These videos are aimed at people looking for basic knowledge about archives and records, and this could honestly apply to anyone. You may be a student that's looking to undertake the Archivist and Records Management course. You may be a librarian that's been asked to work with some archives. You might be a digitisation manager who wants to know more about the collections and the material they're digitising, or you may just have a general interest in archives and records. This is a topic which I think will intersect with many industries, and the idea of these videos is to be as open and as usable for as many people as possible. The vast majority of videos in this channel will be less than 15 minutes, but some of them will get more complex in certain parts. Sources and further reading will always be posted at the end of the video. And also, I would just like to add, if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the comments below. Or if you have any requests, if there's any topics you would like me to make another short video about, please also feel more than free to mention them. I'd be delighted to learn. A quick word about me. I'm an archivist based in London. You can look at my LinkedIn profile here. And lastly, I apologise for my thick accent. I realise if you're not Scottish, you might be struggling a little bit to understand me. Therefore, there'll be a full transcript posted in the description at the end of each video. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the channel and you find this of use. Also, if you find these videos useful, I would be really grateful if you could like and subscribe and possibly hit the bell button as well. Thanks. Okay, so archivists and librarians, this video is going to talk about some of the differences between archive and library science. So first of all, a quick overview of my background. If you haven't already guessed on this channel, my background is primarily archival and records based. However, my MSc is recognised by SILIP and covers training relevant to librarians. I did previously work in a library cataloguing role, and in my current workplace I have the pleasure of working quite closely with librarians. That said, if there are any librarians who watch this video and note anything that's wildly wrong, then please feel more than free to post in the comments below. Okay, so one of the key distinctions I would say between librarians and archivists is how the materials they work with were created. In the library world, you're often working with published materials that was created with the intent to be made publicly available. In the archives world, you're more likely to come across records that were created as part of an activity where the creator had little to no idea that their creations would endure past a certain period. And this has massive implications for how we describe, arrange, sensitivity review, appraise, and provide access to materials. So, published works and books generally tend to have much more natural metadata, such as a clear title and author, etc. Often, archives and records tend not to have this as much when removed from their context. So this means that with archives and records, I would say there's often a lot more research goes on in the background, which is required to quite literally identify what items are. Also, because records and archives are not created specifically for publication, I would personally say the risk of holding potentially sensitive material is greater, and ergo the need to sensitivity review collections is also enhanced. It's also highly common, unless dealing with rare books, that a library will hold multiple copies of the same item. This is not the case in the archive, who tends to look for uniqueness and also with duplicates. It's also in this basis that it's highly unlikely, therefore, that someone would borrow an item from an archive. So, for example, I don't think I've ever worked in an archive that has essentially ran a lending service, whereas libraries are often geared towards making materials available for patrons who can take them out. And I would say this also partly has an implications for how we sensitivity review our collections. So I mentioned that it's my view that archivists and records managers are slightly more focused towards GDPR and data protection. I would say that librarians, and again this is just a personal experience, seems slightly more geared towards copyright as an issue because of the amount of access they encourage for their materials. Okay, so a few words specifically about library and archival catalogues. Because of the lack of natural metadata, archival catalogues rely heavily on context in order to identify and understand the materials in our care. Thus, original order and provenance matter a lot more in archival collections, opposed to library ones where individual items are valuable and discrete components in their own right. In the archival world, a collection is often greater than the sum of its parts, and the individual item matters less when looked at alone. Also, archival catalogues tend to be hierarchical, while library catalogues tend to be flat. So just to explain this a bit more, with archives, we tend to group items into series, and then sub-series, and then files, etc., and thus describe items in bulk. Archival reference codes tend to reflect this, in the sense that archival reference codes are usually quite unique in the terms that the structure of the reference code indicate the actual context of the materials in question. So, for example, in this slide, I've created a fake reference code, XXX124. The 1 may, for example, indicate the first series, the 2 perhaps the second file, and 4 the fourth item. So going backwards, that would be the fourth item and the second file in the first series. And you can sort of observe a potential relationship there in the sense that 124 might be seen as the sibling of 123. And you could also say there's a sort of parent and child relationship between 2 and 4 as well. You tend not to see this as much in library science, who often use barcodes, just simple unique identifiers, to gain intellectual control over their items. That said, if you are a librarian watching this video and you're unsure about this and you're not particularly used to this process, maybe one example that I think is maybe slightly similar is the way librarians use the Dewey Decimal System for subject categorization. Now, they're quite different in the sense that archival reference codes identify discrete parts of a collection, discrete materials within the context of a collection, and the Dewey Decimal System essentially is a way to identify the subject of materials, but they're similar in the way that the longer the numbers get, the more discrete they become. So, for example, with the Dewey Decimal number system, you have a 3-digit number, often followed by a decimal point and even further numbers. The longer that number gets, the more distinct the categories get. So you might go from religion generally to a specific branch of Christianity. And again, archival catalogues are kind of similar in the same way, in the sense that you start with a very broad series grouping and it gets more and more specific the further you go down that series of numbers. Okay, and also I would say that the standards we tend to use are a bit different as well. So archivists tend to use ISA-G, that's the main standard that archivists use, while librarians tend to use MARC. And I've missed out a bullet point there. So yeah, another thing to say is that archival catalogues are very, very rarely itemized, where library catalogues almost always are. And that's quite essential to making those materials available. Okay, so more generally, just some sectorial and structural differences. The main governing body for archivists in the United Kingdom is ARA, while for librarians it's SILIP. There are often different formal training courses, albeit my MSc was accredited by SILIP and the Archives and Records Association, but I'm not sure that's so common. It tends to be my experience, especially speaking to people that went through the graduate trainee schemes. There's often very distinct courses for library students as opposed to archival students. It's also my experience that librarians seem to be predominantly based in large institutions, while archivists can often be found in a greater variety of workplaces. But again, that's just my personal experience. And I would say that archival work tends to lean a little bit closer towards records management and information governance, while library science seems to be a little bit more specific to library books, although there is some overlap between library science and information studies, and I don't think it's uncommon for librarian courses and masters to train people to work in sort of information roles specifically. And to be fair, I think SILIP do have quite a a large umbrella for all sort of information professionals. More generally, I would say that librarians are geared a little bit more for working with patrons and the public, which I personally think is a major pro of working in a library. And overall, library science is probably an older and larger community. Archival science, in many ways, is still quite a young profession that I would say is largely a response to the bureaucratic boom that took place in the 20th century with the mass production of records and documents at incredible and unprecedented pace. It's just my experience that librarianship as a sort of career, as a sort of sector, it seems to have a much longer history, and they're much more established, I would say, than archival science, which seems to be still in a sort of more early developmental phase. But again, that's just my personal insights from working in the profession and working with librarians. Okay, that said, talking about the differences, there is something to be said about the digital landscape and a potential unity between librarians and archivists, or perhaps an area where we have very common interests. Because if there's one area where archivists and librarians are pulled together, it could be to do with digital files, which in some ways have eroded the traditional distinctions between published works and records created as part of an activity. And I would say some areas where librarians and archivists tend to have quite similar tasks as when working with digital files. So for example, Dublin Core is a metadata standard that is used, in my experience, by both librarians and archivists. And of course, digitization is a very common theme among archivists and librarians alike. And you also find organisations such as the Digital Preservation Coalition, who sort of cater and provide knowledge for both librarians and digital archivists. So that's, as our world becomes more and more digital, it is possible that there could be some erosions between the distinctions I've made between librarians and archivists. And what I would find really interesting is if someone's watching this video, say 20 years from now, it would be interesting to know how many of the observations I've made here are still valid and still relevant. Okay, so as I say, in an attempt to keep these videos under 15 minutes, I've probably left an awful lot out. But that said, I have provided some references which I encourage you to look up. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel more than free to leave a comment below and I'd be happy to hear it and possibly get back to it. Okay, thanks again. And if you find these videos useful, I would be very grateful if you could like and subscribe and possibly hit the bell button as well. I'm hoping to do a lot more of these videos in the coming months and year, and liking, subscribing and hitting the bell button will make it more likely that you'll see updates in your feed.